Okay, well, welcome to your second audio recording for pages 46 through 66 of One Day in the Life of Ivan the Denisovich. Just like last time, I'm going to be recording your reading homework over like 3 different segments. So this is start at page 46. Page 46. The escorts all wore short sheepskins, except for half a dozen whose coats trailed the ground. The long sheepskins were interchangeable. They were worn by anyone whose turn had come to man the watchtowers. And once again, as they brought the squads together, the escort recounted the entire power station column by fives. "You always get the sharpest frost at sunrise," said Buvosky. "You see, it's the coldest point of the night." Captain Buvosky was fond of explaining things. The state of the moon, whether it was young or old, he could calculate for any day of the year. He was fading away under your very eyes. The captain, his cheeks were falling in, but he had guts. Out beyond the camp boundary, the intense cold, accompanied by a headwind, stung even Shchukov's face, which was used to every kind of unpleasantness. Realizing that he would have the wind in his face all the way to the power station, he decided to make use of his bit of rag. To meet the contingency of a headwind, he, like many other prisoners, had got himself a cloth with a long tape at each end. The prisoners admitted that these helped a bit. Shchukov covered his face up to the eyes, brought the tapes around below his ears, and fastened the ends together at the back of his neck. Then he covered his nape with the flap of his hat and raised his coat collar. The next thing was to pull the front flap of the hat down onto his brow. Thus in front, only his eyes remained unprotected. He fixed his coat tightly at the waist with rope. Now everything was in order except for his hands, which were already stiff with cold. His mittens were worthless. He rubbed them together, he clapped them together, for he knew that at a moment he'd have to put them back behind his back and keep them there for the entire march. The chief of the escort guard recited the morning prayer, which every prisoner was heartily sick of. "Attention, prisoners! Marching orders must be strictly obeyed. Keep to your ranks. No hurrying. Keep a steady place. No talking. Keep your eyes fixed ahead and your hands behind your backs. A step to the right or left is considered an attempt to escape, and the escort has orders to shoot without warning. Leading guards on the double." The 2 guards and the leader of the escort must have set out along the road. The column heaved forward, shoulders swaying, and the escort some 20 paces to the right and left of the column, each man at a distance of 10 paces from the next, machine guns held at the ready, set off too. It hadn't snowed for a week, and the road was worn hard and smooth. They skirted the camp in the wind, caught their faces sideways. Hands clasped behind their backs, heads lowered, the columns of prisoners moved on as though at a funeral. All you saw was the feet of 2 or 3 men ahead of you and the patch of trodden ground where your own feet were stepping. From time to time, one of the escorts would cry, "You, 48, hands behind back," or "B, 502, keep up." But they shouted less and less. The slashing wind made it difficult to see. The guards weren't allowed to tie cloth over their faces. Theirs was not much of a job either. In warmer weather, everyone in the column talked, no matter how much the escort might shout at them. But today, every prisoner hunched his shoulders, hid behind the back of the man in front of him, and plunged into his own thoughts. The thoughts of a prisoner, they're not free either. They kept returning to the same things. A single idea keeps stirring. Would they feel that piece of bread in the mattress? Would he have any luck at the dispensary that evening? Would they put Bovesky in the cells? How did Tizar get his hands on that warm vest? He'd probably greased a palm or two in the warehouse for people's private belongings. So grease means steals. How else? Because he had breakfasted without bread and eaten his food cold, Shchukov's belly felt unsatisfied that morning, and to prevent it complaining and begging for food, he stopped thinking about the camp and let his mind dwell on the letter he'd be soon writing home. The column passed the wood processing factory, built by prison labor, the worker settlement. The huts had been assembled by prisoners too, but the inhabitants were civilians. The new club, which were convict built in entirety, from the foundation to the mural decorations, but it wasn't they who saw the films there, and then moved out into the steppes, straight into the wind, heading for the reddening dawn. Bare white snow stretched to the horizon to the left, to the right, and not a single tree could be seen on the whole expanse of the steppe. A new year, 1951, had begun, and Shchukov had the right to 2 letters that year. He had sent his last letter in July and got an answer to it in October. At Ust-Izma, the rules had been different. You could write once a month, but what was the sense of writing? He'd written no more often than now. Ivan Shchukov had left home on June 23, 1941. On the previous Sunday, the people who had been to Polomnia to attend Mass had said, "War!" at Polomnia. They'd learned it at the post office, but at Temeninova, no one had a radio in those days. Now they wrote. The radio roared in every cottage. It was piped in. There was little sense in writing. Writing now was like dropping stones in some deep, bottomless pool. They drop, they sink, but there is no answer. You couldn't write and describe the squad you were working with and what kind of squad leader Andrei Popovich was. Just now, he had a good deal to talk about with Kilgus and Let than with his family at home. Neither did the 2 letters a year they sent him throw much light on the way they were living. The coal halls had a new chairman, as if that hadn't happened regularly. It had been promulgated, too, with neighboring farms. That happened before, too. But afterward, they'd reduced it to its former condition. And what else? The farmers were failing to fulfill their quota of work days, or the individual plots had been cut down to 1/3 acre, and some people's right back to the cottage walls. What he couldn't take in was the fact that, as his wife wrote, the number of people in the coal halls hadn't grown by a single soul since the war. All the young men and women, without exception, had managed to get away to work in factories or in the peat processing works. Half the men hadn't come back from the war at all, and among those who had, there were some who had cold-shouldered the coal house. They lived in the village and worked on the side. The only men on the farm were Zakhar Vasilich, the manager, and Tikhon, the carpenter, who was turned 84, had married recently, and already had children. The coal house was kept going by the women who had been there since 1930. There was something about this that Zhukov couldn't understand, living in the village and working on the side. He'd seen life in the days of private farming and the days of kolkhozes too, but that men weren't working in their own villages, this he couldn't swallow. Sort of seasonal workers, were they? Going out traveling, but then how did the village manage the haymaking? They'd given up seasonal work a long time back, his wife had replied. They didn't go out carpenting, for which that part of the country was famous. They didn't make osier baskets, for no one wanted them these days. But they did have a craft, a wonderfully new craft, carpet painting. Someone had brought stencils back from the war, and from that time had become so popular that the number of those carpet painters grew and grew. They had no steady jobs. They didn't work anywhere. They helped the coal halls for a month or so, just at the haymaking or the harvesting, and for that the coal halls gave them a chit saying that so-and-so, a member of the coal house, had been released to carry on his work, and that the coal house had no claim on him. And they traveled all over the country. They flew in the airplanes to save time, and they piled up rubles by the thousand and painted carpets all over the place. 50 rubles, a carpet made out of any old sheet you could spare, and it didn't seem to take them more than an hour to make a carpet of it. And Chekhov's wife nursed a strong hope that when Ivan returned, he too would become one of those painters. Then they'd raise themselves out of poverty in which she was living, and they'd send the children to a technical school and build a new cottage instead of the broken down one. All the carpet painters were building new cottages, and now near the railway station, the cottages had gone up in price from 5,000 to all of 25. Then Zhukov asked his wife to explain to him how he, who had never been able to draw in his life, was going to be a painter, and what were these beautiful carpets like? What did they have on them? His wife answered that you'd have to be an utter fool not to be able to paint the patterns. All you had to do was to put the stencil on and paint through the little holes with a brush. There were 3 sorts of carpets, she wrote: the troika, and often the hussars driving a beautiful troika, the reindeer, and a third with a Persian-style pattern. They had no other designs, but people all over the country were glad to get these and snatch them out of the painter's hands, because a real carpet cost not 50 but 1,000 rubles. How Zhukov longed to see just one of those carpets. During his years in prisons and camps, he had lost the habit of planning for the next day, for a year ahead, for supporting his family. The authorities did his thinking for him about everything. It was somehow easier that way. He still had another 2 winters, another 2 summers to serve, but those carpets preyed on his mind. There was easy money to be made, you see, and made fast, and somehow it seemed a pity to lag behind his fellow prisoners. But frankly, he didn't want to turn a carpet painter. For that, a man needed to be free and easy with people, to be brash, to know how to grease a palm or two. So what he's saying is, in order to get this job, he would have to know how to suck up to other people or to bribe other people. And although Zhukov had trodden the earth for 40 years, although he had lost half his teeth and his head was growing bald, he'd never either given or taken a bribe, nor had he learned to do so in camp. So guys, this part's really important. What's happening is this, right? If when he's released from prison, he could get a good job if he were to bribe somebody. But look, even though he's lost everything, he refuses to bribe because that's just not the kind of person he is. So it's very important. Let's keep going. Easy money weighs light in the hand and doesn't give you the feeling you've earned it. There was truth in the old saying, pay short money and get short value. He still had a good pair of hands, capable hands. Surely when he was out, he'd find work as a plumber, a carpenter, or a repairman. Only if they deprived him of his civil rights and he couldn't be taken on anywhere else, or if they wouldn't let him go home, would he turn to those carpets for a spell. Meanwhile, the column had come to a halt before the gatehouse of the sprawling site on which the power station stood. While the column was still on the move, 2 of the escort, clad in ankle-length sheepskins, had left their places and wandered across open country to their distant watchtowers. Until all the towers were manned, the site was forbidden territory. The head guard, a machine gun slung over his shoulder, advanced to the gatehouse. Smoke, a great cloud of it, belched from its chimney. A civilian watchman sat there all night to prevent anyone stealing lumber or cement. Far in the distance, on the other side of the site, the sun, red and enormous, was rising in haze, its beams cutting obliquely through the gates, the whole building site, and the fence. Alosha, who was standing next to Shukov, gazed at the sun and looked happy, a smile on his lips. What had he to be happy about? His cheeks were sunken. He lived strictly on his rations. He earned nothing. He spent all his Sundays muttering with the other Baptists. They shut the hardships of camp life like water off a duck's bath. During the march, Shukov's face cloth had grown quite wet from his breath. In some spots, the frost had caught it and formed an icy crust. He drew it down from his face to his neck and stood with his back to the wind. He had managed to keep the cold out in most places though his hands were numb and his worn mittens. The toes of his left foot were numb too. That left boot was badly worn. The sole had been repaired twice. The small of his back ached, and so did the rest of it, all the way up to his shoulders, ached and throbbed. How could he work? He looked around, and his eyes fell on the face of the squad leader, who had marched among the last five. Tyran was a broad-shouldered man, broad in his face too. He looked morose as he stood there. He had no jokes or smiles for his squad, but he took pains to see they got better rations. He was serving his second term. He was a true son of the Gulag and knew camp ways through and through. In camp, the squad leader is everything. A good one will give you a second life. A bad one will put you in your coffin. Shukov had known Andrei Tyran since the time they had met at Ust-Izma, though he hadn't been in his squad then. And when the prisoners who were in Article 58 were transferred from general camps to special ones, Tyran had immediately picked him out for his squad. Shukov had no dealings with the camp commandant or the PPD, with the foremen or engineers. That was the squad leader's job. He had protected him with his own chest of steel. In return, Tyran had only to lift an eyebrow or beckon with a finger, and you ran and did what he wanted. You can cheat anyone you like in camp, but not your squad leader. Then you'll live. Shukov would have liked to ask Tyran whether they were to work at the same place as the day before or to go somewhere else, but he was afraid to interrupt his lofty thoughts. He'd only just averted the danger of the squad being sent to work at the socialist way of life settlement, and now he was probably deliberately over the percentage on which the squad's rations for the next 5 days depended. All right, guys, so that's the end of the first segment. Go ahead and do your annotation. So just a reminder, for your annotations, you're doing a dialectical journal. If you forget, refer to the instructions that I gave you in your reading assignment sheet. If you forget, refer to the reading assignment sheet. All right, God bless you and have a great day.